Good evening, welcome to Tyskysour. My name is Bastani. This evening I have the great pleasure of being joined by Michael Walker. Michael, how are you doing?
To be honest, I'm increasingly frustrated and worried about the government's inadequate response to the greatest public health crisis since 1918. Also sending my solidarity to Fox, who is self-isolating at home, although without symptoms.
That's right. Fox isn't here because
it's the right thing to do.
Right thing to do.
Yeah.
We're also joined by Steve Turner. Steve, you're from Unite the Union. You're Assistant General Secretary, is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
And you represent more than 1 million people?
Yeah, 1.2 million across all sectors of the economy, yeah.
And you've got a lot of people in aviation. You said 70,000 people?
70,000 in aviation, in the air and on the ground, yeah.
So you've got maybe hundreds of thousands of members who could be impacted by what's happening right now.
I think our entire membership will be impacted by this.
Of course.
From retired members through to community members. There won't be a section of our union or our movement, actually, that's not impacted by this. It's incredibly worrying times.
Before we go any further, I just want to give our condolences to the friends and family of the 104 people who the government say have been killed by this terrible illness.
Yeah.
That was a jump of 32 people in the last day. And clearly the reach and intensity of the COVID-19 virus is accelerating. While the victims are mostly older, the youngest victim so far has been named as Craig Ruston. He was in his 40s, although he had a pre-existing condition, namely motor neuron disease. The intensification of the crisis, of course, best expressed by the number of people who are falling sick and who are tragically passing away. With every new death, the government and its actions will come under even greater scrutiny. Before we talk about what's going on in the UK, we're going to talk about the US. Because it turns out Donald Trump, of all people, is getting serious about the coronavirus before most other people. Yesterday in the United States, Trump and Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin announced what is effectively helicopter money. We're going to go to that video now and just see, effectively, Donald Trump announcing the deployment of a universal basic income.
Although the president likes the idea of the payroll tax holiday, I will tell you what we've heard from many people, and the president has said we can consider this. The payroll tax holiday would get people money over the next 6 to 8 months. We're looking at sending checks to Americans immediately. And what we've heard from hardworking Americans, many companies have now shut down, whether it's bars or restaurants. Americans need cash now, and the president wants to get cash now.
So that was Donald Trump and Steve Mnuchin talking about spending, what you were saying, 50 billion, Steve?
50 billion, yeah.
And it's going to be, we don't quite know how much, though Steve Mnuchin said it'll be more than what you're seeing in the press, which is quite interesting.
Well, so in terms of this universal basic income that the Americans are talking about, it was first floated by Mitt Romney. So he was a Republican presidential candidate who stood against Obama in 2012 and lost. So he tweeted earlier in the week that, we need to start a UBI, we need to get checks worth $1,000 to every person in the United States. It's coincidentally exactly what Andrew Yang was proposing during the Democratic primaries, but I think that was potentially coincidental. But no, it's a big move. And Donald Trump actually was sounding quite different there to Boris Johnson in what he was talking, or the way he was talking about the crisis. He was basically saying, this crisis wasn't caused by workers. We're going to give them whatever they need. Which is quite a different... I mean, obviously, in other ways, it was a completely appalling speech. And today he was talking about the China virus, sort of like kung flus. He's really trying to... He's absolutely... If we think our government has fucked up on the public health side, Donald Trump has criminally fucked up on the public health side. He has, he's actively stopped various parts of the health infrastructure develop testing equipment. He has been nothing but obstructive. About 2 weeks ago, he was saying this virus is not a big deal. Now what he's trying to do is say, I would have liked it if the Chinese told us earlier what had gone on. Actually, they told the WHO in incredibly timely fashion. So, I mean, he's still more reactionary than our government, but in terms of support they're providing for the working class, potentially more than what our government is managing.
Meanwhile, over here, we've got the DUP now calling for it. Maybe we can get a tweet up recently. I think it was, who was it in particular called for this? We got it up. It was Sam Wilson. A new universal basic income. If Gary can get that, would be great. So the DUP are out-lefting sections of the Labour Party when it comes to an immediate response to what is clearly a really major crisis, the biggest health crisis since 1918. Why is that? Why is the DUP, Mitt Romney, Donald Trump offering a bit more of a propositional offer here than quite a few progressive voices?
Well, I don't think that is the case, to be fair. I think we've been very clear for a long time now even before coronavirus, on the impact of no-deal Brexit, and this has really brought all of that forward quite substantially, of course. We've been arguing to put money in people's pockets and to make sure that businesses are here at the end of this crisis, because this will end. At some point, this will end, and people will have to return to work, and they want to return to decent jobs, good jobs. And those businesses are a real risk right now, and of course, people are at real risk if we're just simply going to move to a position of either short-time working or layoff. And a lot of that layoff will be forced layoff. And there will be millions of workers that will be incredibly concerned about how they're going to pay their rent, how they're going to put food on the table, how they're going to look after their children, how they're going to pay debts, increasing utility costs, and the rest of it. And government are doing very little on that, of course. In fact, for working people, government are doing nothing. For businesses, they're trying to offer loans at competitive interest rates, which is quite interesting to see the Bank of England or whoever it might be making money out of a crisis. I mean, they're not even giving interest-free loans, let alone grants. Business is not asking for loans. Business is indebted. And household debt is probably one of its highest levels that it's been ever in history, to be fair.
So these are the measures undertaken by the Bank of England. The announcement yesterday of £330 billion worth of loans given over to business, keep them tied up. You don't think that's, in isolation, you don't think that's a particularly good way to manage this?
No, it's not. And it's not what business are asking for either. Business are asking for support right now to ensure that at very difficult times, I mean, this is a dual crisis. This is a crisis that's certainly a public health crisis, of course, and this is about people not being able to attend work, whether because they're ill themselves, whether they're self-isolating, or whether they're caring for others in their communities. And it's also a crisis of manufacture. So globalisation, over many years now, we've been warning that globalisation has stretched supply chains to the point where any disruption in a supply chain will have devastating impact on manufacturing in particular. And we're seeing that in a very real way now, not because we've got border controls or non-tariff barriers at Dover or anywhere else, but because the supply chain has simply come to a halt in both China and now in Europe. And that has a very immediate impact on manufacturing industries in particular. So we either get to a place where business is allowed to effectively mothball itself with temporary short-time layoff, and workers are then effectively put on garden leave on full pay for the duration of this crisis, so that at some point in the future, and we would all hope in the not too distant future, of course, industry picks up and workers simply go back to work. And that's what we need to see happening. But of course, the way the government's reacted to this has forced business from crisis to crisis to crisis, and many have now closed. And many of the workers, particularly in hospitality industries, of course, so you've got pub workers, you've got those in hotels, retail, and other sectors of the economy have simply been dismissed. They're very often not on union agreements. It's very low density of trade unionism. But they're not on contracts that imply rights either. 0 hours contracts, very little protection for workers there. And they've simply been dismissed.
Do you think that's why I'll let you come back in a second if that's right. Do you think that's why the French response, nobody thinks Emmanuel Macron is a particularly radical politician, but the French response was really authoritative, decisive, far more so than the UK. Do you think that's because of the militancy of the French labour movement, but also what we've seen with the Gilets jaunes over the last 12, 18 months?
Well, I'm sure that's a factor in all of this. You can't expect people to follow government advice even if you don't facilitate that by allowing them to do that with safety. People need to be confident that they're secure. And in terms of people's basic needs, they need to know that they've got money in their pocket. They need to know that their homes are secure. They need to know that there's food on the table and their children are going to be safe. Their families are going to be safe. And there are so many factors within that that the government are not delivering on that people are not confident at all. What we've seen around panic buying will pale into insignificance if we get hundreds of thousands of working people simply laid off without pay. You'll see civil unrest in our communities.
No, I think the panic buying is actually an interesting example of where the government have failed here, because the government have said don't panic buy. They've also said if anyone in your household falls sick, the whole of your household has to stay in the house for 2 weeks and ideally not leave the front door. Yeah. And those two things are inconsistent unless you say that we are going to make sure there is, emergency services, or you recruit in the Royal Mail or various industries which can be reutilized, as it were. Unless you say we will make sure that no one starves in their house, then panic buying is actually just the rational thing to do. I mean, every household right now does need to have enough food to last them 2 weeks for them to properly be able to follow government advice, which is that if anyone in that household falls sick, they all have to stay behind a closed door for 2 weeks. And it's similar with the sick pay. They've sort of said, we want businesses to keep on their employees, but all they've said is we can give you a loan if you want. Yeah. And then those businesses are presumably just going to think, well, we don't want to pay back a loan which was used initially just to pay workers to do nothing. It doesn't make financial sense to you if you're a business, does it?
It's nuts, yeah, it is. Yeah.
I'm going to do the dirty on Gary, who's now about to fiddle with the camera. So I was going to say, if we can actually just get up that clip up of Rishi Sunak from yesterday, Gary. So then maybe people who are joining us this evening might know what we're talking about. We've got 1,200 people watching. Smash the like button. Let me know, Gary, when we can go to see Rishi Sunak. We've only got 183 likes, 183 thumbs. 1,228 people watching. Also, the link is in the description, so share that on Twitter. We're going to go to Rishi Sunak right now.
I can announce today an unprecedented package of government-backed and guaranteed loans to support business to get through this. Today, I am making available an initial £330 billion of guarantees, equivalent to 15% of our GDP. That means any business who needs access to cash to pay their rent, their salaries, suppliers, or purchase stock will be able to access a government-backed loan or credit on attractive terms. And if demand is greater than the initial £330 billion I'm making available today, I will go further and provide as much capacity as required. I said whatever it takes, and I meant it. That support will be delivered through two main schemes. To support liquidity amongst larger firms, I have today agreed a new lending facility with the Governor of the Bank of England to provide low-cost, easily accessible commercial paper. To support lending to small and medium-sized businesses, I'm extending the new business interruption loan scheme I announced at budget last week so that rather than loans of £1.2 million, it will now provide loans of up to £5 million with no interest due for the first 6 months. Both of these schemes will be up and running by the start of next.
I know we briefly talked about this, but obviously people can catch up again with it. You were talking about Rishi Sunak's intervention while viewers were watching that. How does the government think a solution to a problem of demand? There are no people buying things from stores on high streets. How is a solution to that giving somebody a business loan?
Well, it's not a solution. I mean, that's the problem. Business is not looking for loans right now. Business is looking for practical assistance, and increasing debt on already concerned businesses is not going to incentivise those to stay open during very difficult circumstances. And that's going to have a direct impact on their workforces, of course. This is going to affect business in different ways. Some will work their way through this. Some will go into short time. Some will close indefinitely. And we don't know when this will cease, even though we do know that at some point we're expecting this to end and people to go back to decent jobs. So the priority for us has been, how do you protect ordinary working people? And that means putting money in people's pockets. That's not giving loans to businesses. I mean, who knows what will happen to loaned money in any event? You could simply pay down debt at higher interest rates that is already within the business. You could pay shareholders dividends. You could give yourself a nice pay rise, thank you very much, and walk away trousering a lot of money. It's not a guarantee that that money is going to go into the pockets of working people. And it's working people, it's demand side economics that need to be advanced here. It's working people that need money in their pocket to give them confidence.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's just worth talking about what other countries are doing, because I think what the government are trying to hide behind is like, this is an unprecedented crisis, and all of the things we're doing are, you hear it all the time, the government saying, these are exceptional measures, and the BBC repeat it. So you're supposed to say, everyone's supposed to watch this thing like, wow, that was a big announcement. But you compare it to what other countries are managing, and it's just appalling. It's nothing what they're offering. So let's go through some of them. So Denmark has agreed to pay up to 75% of private sector employees rather than see them laid off. So if you're a business who's thinking, well, why would I keep my workers on when they can't work? Because, in many cases, either they're self-isolating or the supply chains are completely fucked up, or no one wants to go to their restaurant.
Yeah.
So a rational boss in that situation thinks, well, who wouldn't lay off the workers, right? So the Norwegian, or the Danish in this case, have recognised that, and they're saying, well, if you do keep them on, we'll pay 75% of their wages. You've got to pay 25%, just as an act of goodwill or whatever. And that means, and also the government are picking up the sick pay. So So you as an employer have an incentive to keep those workers on, because in Britain you've got a choice where you fire the person and then the government covers they have to go on universal credit, or you just put them on sick pay, in which case you're paying. So our government is just giving businesses loads and loads of incentives to fire loads of people, which is why 200,000 people in the hospitality sector have been fired since mid-February. And what other countries
200,000?
200,000 since mid-February. It's BBC or FT, one of those.
It's all Michael reads these days.
Yeah. But the BBC to critique it, the FT to get all my information. But what the government, let's go through some of the other ones. So Sweden, they've laid off workers a guaranteed 90% of their income. So even if you get laid off, government will pay 50% of that and the employer picks up the other half. So that's another incentive not to lay off your workers, because if you lay them off, you still have to pay a bit of money. And the government, again, will pay sick pay rather than the employer, which means that that gives you an incentive not to lay that person off. Norway, self-employed people, which is what lots of this misses out, they get 80% of their average income for the last 3 years, paid for by the government. So these are people who are recognising. These are governments that are recognising what we need to do is not make people get laid off because of a crisis which doesn't necessarily show that there's an underlying problem with the business model, and not to have people punished for a crisis which they had no control over.
And this is not just the Nordic countries. This is not a Scandinavian phenomenon. This is normal business across Europe. So you're finding packages now, wage protection packages being introduced in Germany, in Austria, in Italy, in Spain, in France, in Belgium, in Holland, in the Netherlands, where workers will receive 90% of their normal pay, paid for by the state. This is an interventionist strategy at state level, pumping billions of pounds, hundreds of billions of euros in their case, directly into the pockets of working people to create confidence amongst ordinary people that there is a way through this. And in doing that, of course, they're allowing businesses that do close, and businesses will close as a consequence of this, we know that, to enable them to reduce their costs. So all fixed costs are being frozen, suspended. Utility bills are being suspended. Tax payments to the state are being suspended. There are no fixed costs placed on those businesses. They can simply mothball themselves, ready to reopen at the appropriate time when we get through this crisis. And a workforce will be ready-made, in place and paid in order to return to work. And that's what should happen here.
You highlighted the stuff in Scandinavia, Sweden, Norway, the Netherlands as well, sort of generally quite a generous welfare state. We were saying before the show, but this is kind of business as usual in a way for a lot of these countries.
Yeah.
We don't really think about it like that because it's so far away from the British model, but quite a few of these countries are very generous in terms of employee layoffs and then how they're treated in sort of quite a beneficent state. Can you go into that with a bit of detail?
Well, Germany is a good example of this. The German state has short-time working provisions, and it's had short-time working provisions since 1910. This is not something new. This is pre-First World War. And what they do, of course, is that employers pay into a fund underwritten by the state, and they do that through in the good times. And when they're entering into a recession or a difficult period of time, such as now with coronavirus, they draw on monies back from the state to either put workers onto short-time work, and the state picks up to 60% of earnings with the employer paying 40%, or in this case, more than 60%, because workers are not going on to short-time work in many cases. They're actually being laid off with no work. So this is not radical. This in 2008, in the crash in the auto industry in Germany, their short-time working provisions effectively saved 500,000 manufacturing jobs. That's the impact of these sorts of direct interventionist measures at a state level. 500,000 jobs were saved, skilled jobs, engineering jobs were saved. And of course, what happened was at the end of the recession, when they ramped up production again, they just simply increased hours. That's the way they dealt with it. And they used the downtime to upskill and retrain their current workforce. So they used it in a very practical way. So although people were only working half hours, the other half of their working week was spent upskilling and retraining. New technologies, the impact of all of the issues, the technological changes that are occurring across our industries right now were accommodated and continue to be accommodated by the systematic approach that's taken in countries like Germany. It's not only Germany. You see this in other countries across Europe. In fact, most of Europe adopt a very similar approach to short-time working and downturns in the economy. It's in the UK where you see the only response, the first response is to lay off. You lay off thousands and thousands and thousands of workers. You lose skills, not just jobs, you lose skills, you lose knowledge, of course, which you can't just replace with an apprenticeship scheme and bringing somebody else in to replace the skill. It's the 30 years of combined knowledge that you lose at the same time. And we've seen that time after time after time. And that's why it's so difficult following a recession for UK manufacturing to get back to its standing.
Can I ask you two questions? To what extent are you liaising with people like the CBI, Confederation of British Industry, or the Federation of Small Businesses? Because obviously I know there's some lines of communication with the government that's quite recent, probably should have happened sooner.
Yeah.
But to what extent are you working with those other groups? And then after that, could you go into some detail about what you think the next week or two will look like for some of the people you represent in manufacturing when plants may shut down and so on?
Well, we have a very good relationship with the industry federations, and we have a joint position on this. I mean, all of the manufacturing industry federations, whether that's the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders or the Aerospace and Defence Society, there are a whole host of businesses that join us in the call for government to act in a different way, a more positive way, a more interventionist way, not just over coronavirus, but over the Green New Deal and the challenges of climate emergency and all of that. I mean, there are a whole host of challenges. There's a perfect storm, if you like, confronting manufacturing here in the UK right now. And it's correlating around coronavirus here and now. But the reality is over the course of the next week or so, we're going to see major manufacturers shutting down their operations. Rolls-Royce will close down on Monday. We saw Toyota and Honda announcing today. Nissan announced today. We'll see Jaguar Land Rover over the course of the next few days run out of components, and therefore they'll be moving into a shutdown period. Now, these are large workplaces, well-organised, unionised workplaces, and we have layoff agreements with these companies. Toyota, for instance, has a full pay agreement. So for that layoff between now and the end of this month, our members in Toyota will receive full pay, and the agreement also covers agency workers working for Toyota. It's a great agreement. That will last until the end of the month, and I'm sure the company, during the course of this month, will be knocking on our door to talk about how we extend that and on what terms we extend that. But the difficulty we're going to have is beyond the main manufacturing plants, in the supply chain, you have companies at first, second and third tier, of course, all supplying components at various levels into those manufacturing plants that won't survive this. They haven't got the capital resource or the human resource to get over this unless governments step in. And that's why government need to step in, not with loans to be repaid at some time in the future, but with direct financial assistance to these companies, either to retain their productive capacity, even on short-time work, if that's appropriate, or to mothball until such times as we can reopen and up productive capacity.
I just wanted to ask some clarification because it's something I'm not entirely sure about. When you say that the people at Jaguar Land Rover or wherever are going to get laid off on Monday, do you mean they're going to get made redundant, or they're going to get told not to come into work because we're shutting down production for a while? Will they still be employees?
They'll still be employees.
They'll still be employees.
They'll still be employees. No, the plant will shut. The plant will shut, just as many have shut today. People will be sent home. There'll be no requirement to come to work, but they'll receive full pay.
Yeah. And how long is, in your agreement, how long will they get that full pay for?
Well, that's indefinite in our agreements, but there's a practical reality over this. The longer this goes on, nobody believes perhaps at the end of this month we're going to be in a better place, and people are therefore going to be returning to work. So we'll be looking to extend what currently has been announced on the same terms. But to think that we can do this indefinitely would be naive. Mm-hmm. And so, we have to talk to government. Government needs to step up to the plate and do its part, just as other European governments do, and even Trump in the United States, as we spoke about earlier, has started to do, to push demand-side economics and pump money into the economy, putting it in the pockets of people, not shareholders, banks, and corporations.
We've got 1,500 people watching, which is fantastic. And I just want to say thank you to Rachel Mandela, if that's your real name, lucky you, for £20 super chat. Very much appreciated. If anybody wants to support what we're doing, we'll be carrying on right through this. We'll be broadcasting Tyskysour 3 nights a week, probably almost certainly actually after today, remotely. But nothing will change, in the famous words of Theresa May. If you want to help us do that, go to support.novaramedia.com. Help us build a new media for different politics. One of the fortunate aspects of being quite an agile, small media outlet is we can probably carry on in a way that a lot of bigger media outlets can't. And cover this in a really, really critical way. And something Michael said actually right at the beginning of this, he was sort of saying journalism, it's not logistics, it's not pharmaceuticals, But in a political crisis, it's actually a very important piece of public infrastructure in terms of information, in terms of accountability, etc. And so we're not going anywhere. We hope you'll support us. I've got a question before we move on. You talked about various factories where you have members sort of shutting down over the next week, 10 days. It seems to me that the way these shutdowns are happening is much worse than 2008.
Yeah.
Because that was a very slow process. It was a financial crisis, right? It became a crisis of confidence, and then all of a sudden demand falls. But, it started with the housing market a year earlier. Is this a more intense and rapid crisis than what we saw in 2008 in terms of manufacturing?
Yeah, absolutely it is. It's a crisis of sales as well as a crisis of production. It's a public health crisis. It's not a crisis in the banking system that can be resolved just by quantitative easing or pumping money into the banks themselves or loaning money to businesses. This requires direct intervention at a local level in communities, into families, as I've said, consistently into the pockets of ordinary people. That's what needs to happen here. And we'll talk about this at some other point, but when we come out of this, of course, we need demand side incentives to reboost the economy because people aren't buying right now. And we need to make sure that those suppliers that I spoke about earlier are still in business to supply when them big manufacturing plants reopen, because they won't be reopening if we haven't got that third tier supplier producing and then supplying that part. And some of those parts are safety critical in the process, and very small parts, insignificant in the scheme of things, but absolutely essential to that process. And if they're not in business producing at the end of all of this, it's going to be very difficult to see our productive capacity increases.
Right, we're going to move on. It looks like things are going to get quite strange over the next few days in terms of a shutdown. It seems it's finally coming here. This is a story today, it's on the BBC, about schools in Scotland and Wales to close from Friday, if we can get that up. Bizarre that it's not coordinated across the UK, but whatever. Presumably England is following them not long after. Schools was something of a sacred cow for the government. We don't quite know why, in terms of whether or not they would be closed. Do you think the fact that schools are only shutting now, look, we had coronavirus declared a major pandemic in January. Do you think that the government's responding in this manner with schools to just show that there's really no plan at all?
Yeah. I mean, I think what I find so frustrating in terms of the government response is they keep saying it's about timing. It's about timing. But at the same time, they're saying, it's about time. We need to wait until the crisis gets urgent enough for us to close schools or for us to provide the kind of pay packet that would allow self-employed people to not go into work even when they feel sick or when one of their family members is sick. Because, that's the position the government are putting people in. They're saying, if you go out of your house when your partner's got a fever, you're endangering the population. But also, we're not going to do anything to help you financially if not going out is financially ruinous for you. And they say it's all about timing. It's all about timing. But we know that upwards of 66,000 people now in Britain, according to the chief medical officer, have coronavirus. We know that the NHS critical care units are already at full capacity. And we've got government ministers who are calling out for more ventilators on Twitter, right? So this doesn't seem like, it doesn't seem like we can afford for any more people to get infected than currently are, right? If we don't have enough tests for doctors to get tested for coronavirus, if we don't have enough masks for doctors to wear masks when they're treating someone with coronavirus, and if we don't have enough ventilators for people who are about to die from coronavirus, then why the hell would you wait any longer to shut down things than you absolutely need to? So this idea that, we were waiting until the perfect moment to shut the school, we were waiting for the perfect moment to shut down London. Like the perfect moment was clearly, obviously, to everyone that's not a fucking idiot or who potentially values the economy over human lives, it would have been last Monday. Yeah. Like the fact that they're saying, we have to wait. The right time has passed long ago.
But even if you prioritize the economy over human life, I still think it's the wrong approach. I mean, in retrospect, you could have shut the borders down a month ago, 6 weeks ago. Any kind of outbreak, you could have monitored, rigorous testing. Okay, long term, because of global supply chains, etc., that's not viable. But you could keep the country ticking along. And what they've done now, it just seems like the worst of all worlds. And so it does incline me to think that there really wasn't ever really a bigger plan. And you kind of look, Britain's the 5th largest economy in the world, 65 million people. It's a historic power. You would expect some forward planning with regards to a pandemic. I mean, it's happened before. And I find that quite surprising. We're going to pull up a story in the Financial Times, ties into this. If Gary can get this up, London lockdown imminent to slow coronavirus outbreak. And it looks like London will be set to face the toughest measures as it is ahead of the curve on the outbreak. There's not a curve, it's not scientifically inevitable. But there we are, that's the language that's being used. What do you make of this, Steve? Why do you think all of a sudden London's going to be on lockdown? 3 weeks ago, Boris Johnson was talking about shaking hands with people in NHS hospitals.
And still not being tested himself,
no.
Despite being in areas where clearly others have now been tested and diagnosed. Well, I think it is grossly negligent. I think people have died. I mean, that's the reality of it because of government inactivity and inaction on this. And many more people are, of course, infected than the current testing regime would indicate. We have serious problems with testing of individuals. In fact, individuals are no longer being tested. That's the reality of it. Unless you're seriously ill or you're going to be hospitalised, you're not going to be tested. And so WHO guidelines on this about test. Let's establish exactly the spread of this, the scope of the spread and the speed of the spread. And that's the only way in which you can fight this virus outside of having a vaccine, and a vaccine's some way off here, although they're trying, to use existing drugs and previously successful drugs in other circumstances to see whether or not we can slow the spread of this, which is incredibly important for all of us. I think not taking decisive action earlier has put more people at risk. That's unquestionable.
I want to ask a question about ventilators. There was a very interesting article in the New Statesman a couple of days ago, which was saying this fact that we have a shortage of ventilators, which the government only realised on Sunday when they started tweeting out if anyone can make extra ones. That's been known for a long time. So the government did a model again. They've become a bit disreputable at this point in time. But a model to say how would Britain's healthcare cope in a time of a pandemic? And the conclusion was very clear: we don't have enough ventilators. The government hasn't done anything. The government didn't do anything since then to get more ventilators. And now, as we've said, they're calling out for industries which haven't made ventilators to suddenly massively convert all of their operations to keep the population breathing, what Boris Johnson called Operation Last Gasp. I wouldn't mind the joke if it came with actual ventilators. But I wanted to ask you, because I know you're working a lot with industry and business owners, and obviously it would be the workers who, in Boris Johnson's idea, would be making these ventilators. Do you see this as plausible? Are there businesses and industries that can convert themselves quite quickly into being able to produce enough ventilators to keep people with coronavirus breathing properly?
Well, I think the productive capacity of the state, the collective resources of our nation can produce enough ventilators for us. But the idea, and our members would be more than happy to play their part in all of this. I think anybody with any right-minded person right now will do whatever is necessary in order to make to make this a better place. The reality, though, if it wasn't so serious, it's laughable to believe that auto plants can shift production from automotives to ventilators. This is a completely different level of engineering requiring clean room environments. This is a scientifically technical piece of medical equipment that requires clean room manufacturing, that requires components that come from China, as far afield as China and South Asia, through Europe, all of which are currently suffering from logistical issues on the distribution of components, hence the problems we've got across manufacturing per se. We haven't got a blueprint for this. We haven't got the tooling for this. We haven't got the engineers for this, although we've got the engineering capability to do this. So we can pull together and we could create an environment in which certain industries, certain areas of the economy could transfer production from one item to another. And we could do that with a plan. The problem is there is no plan. There is no blueprint. There is no technical drawing. Flippant statements, sound bites are being made without detail and scratch the surface, and they're worthless statements in reality, which is a gross betrayal of our people and our nation, in my view. If you're serious about this, you talk to serious people that do have the engineering capability to do this. You don't make bland statements, wild statements that car plants can simply transfer production from cars to ventilators overnight.
What I find amazing, and we'll talk about this in the final section before we go to questions, is the media. It's how a government minister can say this and a journalist won't think, let me interrogate that point. Yeah. Can you repurpose an automotive plant to make ventilators? I'd imagine you probably can't. Before we go any further, like I said, we're going to talk about the media in a second. The show link is in the description if you're watching this on YouTube. If you want to share it, put it on the hashtag Tyskysour. We'd be very grateful. Also, ask a question there as well as in the comments. For those listening on SoundCloud or on iTunes.
Or any good podcasting app.
Or Spotify. You can, of course, review this show on iTunes. We rarely talk about that. I believe we've got more than 500 five-star reviews, which is great. It'll go higher, which is important. And I'm saying that particularly because our new podcast, or our relaunched podcast, The Burner, goes out on Monday. I believe that's going to be a daily podcast, am I right? That's going to be led on by James Butler, but it's going to involve the whole Navarro family. A daily 10-minute-ish podcast talking about all things coronavirus related, the economy, how the government is dealing with things or failing to deal with things. And before we go on, one last thing, Tyskysour is going to be broadcast remotely from this Friday. So this is the last time we'll be broadcasting to you from the studio. On Friday, it might just be Gary here by himself in a what are those suits called again? A hazmat suit. A bubble, yeah, kind of like Homer Simpson in his nuclear power plant. Michael, you wanted to talk about some media scrutiny, or rather the absence of it, in terms of government modelling.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk about this because on Monday's show, we talked about how last week the government were talking about a herd immunity strategy whereby 60% of the population would get coronavirus in a reasonably short space of time, so over a sort of 4 or 5 months. And then ultimately we'd get through it, and then by next winter, enough people would be immune or have some immunity to coronavirus for us not to have another peak next winter, next Christmas. We still don't know whether or not whether that immunity will happen. I mean, what most people are suggesting is that with a normal coronavirus, you do get immunity and it tends to last a year or two. So
cold is 3 months, right?
Different types of colds can be different lengths. So a cold can be anywhere between 3 months and 2 years.
That was Dr. Rita Reese,
but I think it's more likely to be at least a season.
Right.
So
till the next strain comes along.
Yeah, so the science behind it wasn't completely ridiculous. What was completely ridiculous is the idea that the health service could handle 60% of the population getting coronavirus in a 4-month period. And this became, it seemed over the weekend that maybe the government had shifted their strategy but weren't being particularly honest about it. After we finished our show on Monday, it got made public that actually the modelling that the government had been basing their strategy on was completely wrong. It was wrong because they thought that only a very small proportion of people who entered hospital would have to go over into ICU to have ventilators and to have a much more intensive regime of care from the NHS. And that whilst the strategy, so the modelling, when you actually put in the right data instead of the wrong data, shows that the government strategy as it currently existed would kill 250,000 people. The modelling also showed that if the government took a different strategy, so the government, what they said is we're going to delay, which means we're going to accept that basically most people are going to get it, but we're going to try and, what they always say, flatten the curve. Yeah. This paper says that actually if they suppress it, which is to say we try and make as few people pass on this disease as possible, we can get deaths down to about 20,000. Now, obviously, it's good that the people who are making this model realised their mistake. That's great. But the fact that the government were pursuing the wrong strategy, and it was always a high-risk strategy, even if it was the right strategy, it was always a strategy whereby the downside of it is fucking awful, and the upside of it is just that we have slightly less disruption.
Well, we were talking about this, a week, 2 weeks ago, and we said, how do you communicate something which says, well, look, a lot more people are going to die now than other countries, but it's going to pay off in a year's time. And even just a week later, you look at that and you think, wow, that was insane. Yeah.
But in any case, so what was important in revealing this is it became clear that the modelling was wrong. right? And what we heard all last week from the government was anyone who said, we think your strategy sounds overly risky. The idea that you are just going to let this virus run wild in the hope that enough people get herd immunity. We're not sure we're comfortable with that. And what were we told, not just by the government, but also by Laura Kuenssberg, Robert Peston, all of the media was like, the government are being led by the science. We were even told, there were headlines saying, Boris Johnson was thought of as a populist. He's proven he's not because he is being led by the science. That whole period of time, there were people from the World Health Organization, I mean, a bunch of incredibly reputable scientists, the editor-in-chief of The Lancet, saying that this strategy is crazy.
Every other state around the world.
Saying that this is not how coronavirus works. We were told, no, listen to the science, listen to the science. So I thought the fact that this had been revealed would mean that actually maybe the media would become a bit more critical about what the government means when they say we're being led by the science. For example, the Labour Party were calling all over the weekend for this modelling to be made public. They were saying, at least if the outcomes of this modelling seem a bit counterintuitive, we should at least be able to see the modelling. If this modelling from Imperial College had been made public a week ago, someone would have noticed that mistake, right? And so I was hoping that the BBC would change their tune. But let's look at actually how this was covered. So we can go to now a tweet from the BBC News. So this is, the official BBC position, and it reads, suppression is the only viable strategy at the current time. And it says, the science has shifted dramatically, which is why people in the UK are now facing huge changes to their daily lives. So it's the science that has shifted. There's nothing about politics here. This was the science that shifted. And the official line is, new information has emerged. We only realised this many people were going to ICU when we looked at Italy. I'll show you in a moment why that's bullshit. But let's now look at the Beth Rigby tweet. So she's political editor at Sky. Analysis. We've talked about another of her big tweets where she always puts them in analysis and then just writes what could be a government press release. Why the step change? The facts have changed. A senior government source told me last night, we've had to accelerate. We thought we could put these measures off for another week and push social shielding back a week after then, but we've had to bring it forward. So she said, the science has changed. There was no mistake that was made. New information emerged, and our government, who are being led by the science, responded to that new information and changed policy. That's complete bullshit. And don't just take that from me, because I know, I've always been very open with the fact that I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not even a scientist, right? So take it from the editor-in-chief of The Lancet, Britain's most prestigious medical journal. We'll take his tweet. Laura Kuenssberg says that the science has changed. This is not true. The science has been the same since January. What has changed is that government advisors have at last understood what really took place in China, what is now taking place in Italy. It was there to see. When I saw that yesterday morning, I quote tweeted that saying, look, this guy should be on BBC News because there's been a fuck up here. I watched BBC News last night. The package included, it didn't mention the WHO, didn't mention that the government adopting this strategy was controversial. All they said was the science has changed. They said new information has emerged from Italy, which means the science has changed. They interviewed two experts. Who were the two experts? They were both people from Imperial College who had worked on the original modelling. It's like you couldn't make it up. Like the BBC at this point in time, for the government to be creating good policy, which keeps us alive, has to be holding their feet to the fire, not just attacking them for the sake of it, because obviously we it's one of the few occasions where we at Novara Media want the Tory government to succeed. But to make sure that the advice they're giving is the correct ones and the actions they're taking is the correct ones. And nothing has, you're saying Theresa May's line, nothing has changed. We've seen that the science that the government is accepting is not, sent from God. It can be mistaken. In this case, it was seriously, dramatically mistaken, and lives will be lost because of it, which means that this needs to be public, which means that scrutiny needs to be allowed, not dismissed. And that means that our media establishments need to take their job seriously.
Steve?
Yeah. Well, what can you say following that? I couldn't have put it better myself. I think it's grossly negligent of the press not to have exposed this in the way, to have exposed it in the way they have, as if a new decision's been taken in light of new evidence. It's an old employer's trick. If you've been around industrial relations for a long time, they don't change decisions. They make new ones in light of new evidence. And that's what the government have done here, of course. They've said that new evidence has come along that's forced us to take a different path. Of course, if you scratch the surface, the evidence was always there. The evidence was there in China. The evidence was there in Italy. The evidence is there in any other European country where the epidemic has taken root, and indeed around the globe. The UK was pretty much on its own in the way in which it was responding to it. And you're right. I mean, the way in which the UK government responded has led to people losing their lives. and that statement from Johnson that you're going to lose loved ones. I mean, what a statement to make. You're going to lose loved ones. People will die as a consequence of this. And when you now hear about the actual available evidence that was there at the time and ignored by somebody ignored the evidence. That's the reality of this. And that has consequences. And now they're going to have to be held responsible for that. But you need a press to enable that to come to the fore. And of course, our press are clearly not doing that right now. And you have to ask yourself why.
There's a startling statistic, which is that obviously Britain right now, we've had about 115 deaths at the time of this broadcast. South Korea has had 84. South Korea, which is next to China, obviously it was subject to this virus in a far more intense manner far before we were. And this idea that there's this inevitable curve, it's kind of like the sun rises, the sun sets. That's how the coronavirus works. Well, look at the South Korean response. Look at ours. And it's clear that politics matters. Do you think the way that the media's covered this, Steve, do you think, you said the word negligent, but, when the media misreports what a politician has said or trade union negotiations or, inside baseball at Westminster, ultimately that doesn't matter. But the stakes are so high now, aren't they? So is there something we can do to hold journalism to better account? Because if they don't demand transparency from politicians about life or death matters, then who can? Is that something that trade unions can press? Is that something that businesses and political parties can press on?
Well, clearly that is. I mean, Labour have trying to do a lot of things in terms of trying to release the evidence that was available to the government at the time on which they made decisions or didn't make decisions. I think it's very difficult because it's not an occasion where you want to make political capital out of this.
No.
I mean, you made the point earlier that we actually want the government to succeed here, and I don't want them to succeed on many things, but I do want them to succeed here. I want action, direct action to be taken to save our aviation industry, to save thousands of people from succumbing to the coronavirus. And many, many, many will lose their lives, of course. And I don't want to see that. I want the government to succeed. But the press have a significant role to play in this. And I think their failure to report what is blatantly obvious and actually staring them in the eyes begs questions about why they're not. Now, maybe there's a question for them about the timing of all of this. And what they don't want to do is people to lose confidence in the government. I mean, whether people have got confidence in the government now or not is a different question. But maybe they don't want to see government collapse. They don't want to see government exposed for its failings right now. And that will be exposed at some point in the future. And that may be a legitimate argument that at some point will come out. But the reality of it is decisions are being taken by government in a grossly negligent way, based not on scientific evidence. And that has cost lives. And if we continue along that track, it will continue to cost lives.
We've got 2 super chats in from This Was Not Made, €10. Thank God someone's holding them to account. Great work, lads. We do. We had Dr. Rita Easton as well. But yeah, please chip in if you can, people. That's very kind of you to say. Thank you. And also from John Canning, top rant, Michael. Somebody said it would go straight as a clip, and you're absolutely correct. That's exactly what will happen. Normally we do just an hour. Normally we'd log out at 9 o'clock. We're going to go for another 10 minutes. 10 past 9. So any questions you've got, please put them in the comments section with a rocket emoji, particularly if they're addressed to Steve. He's really in the thick of it right now. So's, the union. Obviously, a lot of their members are affected. Also put questions on the hashtag Tyskysour. And like I say, we've got 1,870 people watching live, only 758 thumbs up. So it doesn't cost you a penny. If you can't make a financial contribution, a lot of people can't right now. On the other hand, there are lots of people who are still earning money, working from home, and they've got nothing to spend it on. If you're one of those people, feel free to make a subscription of some kind. But smashing the like button costs nothing. Gary, if we can just get these up on the comms doc, talk about exams. That's a very good question, actually. A lot of people are worried about the exams of their kids and whatnot. Let's see what we've got. Like I say, particularly for Steve, would be much appreciated. Should the Labour leadership contest result be delayed? That's from John. Steve?
Well, I don't think it'll be delayed, but I don't think there'll be a public gathering for the announcement. I mean, that's on the 4th of April. That's the reality of it. I mean, Labour needs to sort itself out in terms of its leadership. The ballot's coming to a close, and we need a leader in place. So no, I don't see any delay in that.
Do you think you should keep the shadow cabinet as it is? There's an argument that people are in their they have their portfolios, they know what they're doing. You don't want to mess things up too much.
Well, that's a question for him at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But no, I wouldn't want to see too many changes. I mean, you've got people that are incredibly competent, doing a great job of work, holding government to account, and they have done for a long period of time. We're in a particularly difficult period right now. No doubt there will be changes, and whoever wins this will want to bring in and make certain changes and bring people into the cabinet, shadow cabinet, and that's fine. But we need to hold government to account right now as an effective opposition, and that requires people who know their portfolio, who know their brief.
Michael, should it be cancelled?
No, I think there's no reason to cancel the Labour leadership election. I think, one, the threshold for cancelling, democratic elections should be quite high. Yeah. This is online, so it doesn't present any health risk. Also, in terms of, has it shaped the debate to the extent that, hustings were cut short? I mean, most people had already voted, and we kind of know who's going to win. My one hope here is that it's going to be Keir Starmer who wins. I mean, obviously, if I'm wrong, that'll be very embarrassing for me. What I'm hoping is that he learns how to be a fucking leader of the opposition quite quickly, because he has been shockingly absent during this period. And this actually should be something he's quite good at, because where the government are really fucking up is one on sort of, it's not class war that you have to do right now. It's you have to say your plan is inconsistent, because if you're saying the right thing for people to do is stay at home and you haven't given them the financial capability to do that, then your plan sucks, right? Yeah. And Keir Starmer is supposed to be the details guy. And so he should be able to go on TV, go on the radio and quite, convincingly say, look, this isn't me just being a usual politician saying X, Y, Z. This is me with my lawyerly goggles on saying that there is something fundamentally wrong with this plan. And, that hasn't happened. So obviously, I want the Tory government to be a success in tackling coronavirus. I want Keir Starmer to be a success as leader of the opposition. So this is all said as genuine advice, even if I'm not that confident it's going to be taken on.
You said he's a details guy. I mean, that's the thing. He is a details guy. So it may be the case that he would wait a week for all the details to come in about, okay, well, does £330 billion worth of business loans, how's that really going to work? What the 20, 30 different voices? Or there's a counter argument. Okay, can it be disproved? Why? Which, okay, if you're a senior civil servant, I get that. If you're the leader of the opposition in an emergency situation, you probably need to combine, like you say, a little bit of political leadership. Right now, we're not seeing that. We've got £2 from Oliver Kant. Thank you very much, Oliver. He asks, will there be a global depression, Steve?
Well, I think there'll be a recession. We're moving into a recession. Whether that extends into a depression or not, only time will tell. Depending on how governments react to this will be about whether or not we can pump prime the economy coming out of coronavirus, coming out of the pandemic.
So if the government doesn't
take direct action to do that, if the government allows hospitality workers to fall by the way as a consequence of no action to support them, which is the case right now, we've got hundreds of thousands of people simply being dismissed in bars, restaurants, hotels up and down the country without any recourse to any safety net, effectively. And they're incredibly worried. If the government allows the aviation industry to collapse without direct intervention, if the government allows the manufacturing industries to collapse without support for the supply chain, and hundreds of thousands of workers to effectively be placed onto forced layoff as a consequence of this, not because they're ill, but because their industries are not capable of continuing for one reason or another, either for public health reasons or for supply chain rationale. The reality is we will enter into a depression. We need to retain supply side demand. We need demand side pressure on government right now. We need to put money in people's pockets.
Michael? It's going to be a depression, which for viewers out there is effectively a prolonged recession, akin to what we saw after 1929.
I mean, probably. I mean, there's an interesting way of looking at it, because what I suppose Boris Johnson wants us to think is that there's a choice between, being completely precautionary when it comes to health and sort of protecting our usual way of life and the economy and not everything not collapsing, which is why I was always talking about timing and behavioural fatigue or whatever. Behavioural fatigue was always bullshit, to be honest. But the only reason we're having to make that choice, and obviously we should choose health over the economy, the only reason we're having to make that choice is because our government was so disastrously underprepared for this kind of event. So if you look at Korea, where, as Aaron said, I can't remember how many deaths it was, but it was very few.
84.
84, so they've had less deaths than the UK, even though they got the virus way earlier in a much bigger deal. They're much closer to China. They have their economy will be much healthier than ours by the end of the year. And they've managed to stop way more deaths than we have, and we will. And that's because they invested properly in testing capacity. They invested properly in the kind of technology that allows you to trace contacts when someone is found to have coronavirus. And it's because they have the capacity in their public services and the state capacity to respond to healthcare crisis properly that it will be places like Korea that are actually keeping the world economy going. They're the places where we're going to be able to get parts because they invested properly in testing and the kind of healthcare systems which mean that the only way to stop a virus isn't to lock people in their homes.
Maybe we'll be buying our ventilators off them.
Hopefully, actually. I mean, hopefully they'll ramp up their...
It's quite plausible,
production,
isn't it? This is a question from Jamie Hall. How are people like myself that don't have a job meant to get by now? So presumably Jamie either is underemployed or is on 0 hours contracts or is about to be laid off. Steve, what should Jamie do in terms of just making sure he can meet his bills at the end of the month? What actions can he take with other people that could perhaps elicit a favourable response from government?
Well, a favourable response from his employer right now might be helpful.
Yeah.
So join a union. Join a union if you're not in a union because, collective agreements are providing protection for people right now on layoff pay. As I said earlier, we've got hundreds of thousands of our members that are going to end up laid off, but they're going to be laid off on pay. I mean, that's the reality of it. Many hundreds of thousands, if not millions and more, are not. And the government's response to this is simply to say, we'll go and sign on and claim universal credit, which you don't get for 5 weeks, which is a paltry sum, similar to that of SSP, statutory sick pay, of course. So if you fall sick, if you earn enough in order to qualify for it, so the lowest paid workers earning less than £118 a week don't even qualify for statutory sick pay. If you do, you get your £94.25 a week. Now that's quite disgraceful. So sick pay needs to be increased to the living wage as an absolute minimum. The actual living wage, not the government's national living wage, the actual living wage. And of course, people who find themselves unemployed right now because of the coronavirus need to be protected by direct government action. So this is a great example of where government action to protect the business, to enable it to mothball itself, close itself down effectively, go into a state of closure, but pay its workers for a direct fund, wage support, to enable workers to be paid by their employer during a very difficult time, so that when we come out of this, that business will simply reopen and those workers will simply go back to work. You could even use this time to upskill and to train that workforce rather than just putting people on downtime. If they're fit and they're healthy enough to be trained, and a lot of training can be done online, of course. You don't need to go into collective environments in order to do that. You could actually use this opportunity to upskill our current workforce. And you can do that in hospitality and easier in some other sections. There are a whole series of online programs. We've been looking at that today with our members about how we could utilise downtime if only the government would come forward and provide the resources to enable people to be on full pay whilst off work. That's what needs to happen.
It's a really interesting idea. All of a sudden just doing 2 years of adult education while we wait for this thing to be resolved. Also, I suppose if you're a renter, there are other things that he's probably worried about. I mean, it's obviously the working side, but...
Well, we've spoken to government about rent controls. We've spoken about food pricing. We've spoken about the ending of exploitation in the market, which will be a factor. As you get shortages, of course, there will be those that will want to exploit that. So the state has to take some quite draconian measures, actually, outside of wartime that you wouldn't expect the state to take. But you do need rent controls. You do need absolute protection, not just for landlords, but for tenants, particularly in the private rented sector, to ensure that they're not at risk of eviction. And you need mortgage protection, of course, for those
how
that are in
alive are
debt.
the government do that? How alive are the government?
Well, they are making statements. They spoke about 3 months mortgage protection. They're now talking about financial protection for landlords. They're not speaking about tenants. They're talking about financial protection for landlords. Well, if you deal with the pay question and you have people at home on pay, of course, as a result of wage policy, then you don't need to talk about people's fears around whether or not they're going to be able to pay their rent or put food on the table or look after their children, because they'll be paid in exactly the same way as they would have been paid if they continued to be at work. And that's what will happen across Europe. And that's why I don't think there'll be a depression. There may be an absolute recession here in the UK because we're not positioning ourselves in the right way to come out of this in the right way. But across Europe, of course, what they'll do is they'll ramp up production. They'll increase demand side measures to ensure that there's a market for products And you can do that. The auto industry, again, is a great example of that. Why not use this as an opportunity to transition away from combustion and more to battery or hydrogen technologies, synthetic fuels, and all those things that we actually need to do to compete with the challenge of the climate emergency. There are things that you can do. There are long-term measures you can take. There are immediate and short-term measures you can take. But you need a constructive government that's prepared to intervene to do that. And unfortunately, we've got an ideological one that thinks lending money to employers is the answer to this, and it's not.
It's probably just there was an announcement on renters today. So yesterday, everyone was, I mean, it was fairly shocking, to be honest, that they announced there was going to be a holiday for mortgage holders, but absolutely nothing on renters. They promised something on renters. That's come today. What they've said is there's going to be a guarantee that renters aren't evicted during this period, but that doesn't mean that their rent, it's not a rental holiday.
No.
And if you go onto the government website, they've sort of explained how this debt to your landlord will work. And I quote, "At the end of this period, landlords and tenants will be expected to work together to establish an affordable repayment plan taking into account tenants' individual circumstances. The government will also issue guidance which asks landlords to show compassion." Now, I don't know if anyone's ever rented a property. Relying on landlords to show compassion is not something that's going to reassure many tenants. No. That's not, I'm not here to,
I'm sure there are some nice ones, but there's some really
I'm
bad
sure there are
ones
some
as well.
nice landlords, but it's the whole response of the government to this has been to basically give people advice, but give them no rights.
Yeah.
And if you say we're advising you to stay home if your family is sick, but we're not going to give you the right to stay home on full sick pay, then that's just that's crap.
Yeah.
And if you say we're going to advise businesses to give you sick pay and let you stay, to be compassionate so you can stay off work with your family. But then what if someone's got a shit boss and people sharing these on Twitter, where you've got a boss that says you've got to come in or you're fired. And I saw on Twitter today there was someone whose landlord had arranged someone to view their flat today. And they said, we're not really comfortable with that given the circumstances. And they were like, well, I mean, I've already arranged it. They're coming. There's nothing you can do about that. So it's just like, if you don't give people rights, then they are subject to the kind of exploitation that's going to endanger their life in this situation and endanger everyone else's life.
That's what the state is for, right? The state is there to arbitrate between people with competing interests. You can't just rely on the goodwill of landlords and employers. And
people will be genuinely fearful about that. Of course they will. People who can't, the level of household debt is already at a level that we haven't seen in modern history. To simply pile more and more debt onto people that are already in very difficult circumstances, they don't know whether they're going to be returning to a job, what that job might look like. They're not necessarily on pay now, unless they're covered by an agreement, of course, a layoff agreement with their employer. If they're sick, they're on statutory sick pay at £94.25 a week, which is unlikely to enable them to put food on the table if they've got a family, let alone pay the rent and utility bills and everything else. So they're going to be incredibly worried that this debt is building up. And the government can put £1 trillion on the table. But if it's simply a loan to be repaid at some point, there's no money on the table.
Well, in a sense, it's worse because, that's just, you're effectively writing it off and you're saying, we're going to double our debt to GDP ratio in 10 years' time. That's what it is, basically, right? It's just an admission that...
But you owe us it, and you're going to pay it back. And by the way, you're going to pay it back on competitive rates of interest.
Yeah.
So someone's going to make money out of this.
Best case scenario, yeah. We've got 1,856 people watching. We're going to wrap up in 5 or 10 minutes, but it'd be great to go above 2,000. And like I say, smash the like button, 973 likes. We're going to take one more question because we did actually start 10 minutes late. So if you guys don't mind. This is from FB. You've talked about the failings of the media in this crisis. What do you make of Labour's response, especially that of the 3 leadership candidates? Michael?
Crap from all 3. Rebecca Long-Bailey's been making the right demands, but she's been making them in the form of tweet threads and one think piece. And there are lots of people in the country right now who are scared, who feel like the government is taking the wrong actions. I believe they are too, and is not representing them. So the government is saying, if you've lost your job at this point and you're worried about finances, just go onto the Universal Credit website. I went onto the Universal Credit website today, not because I'm unemployed. Fortunately, Novara Media is still functioning because of your kind support. But to see what it says, if you were to follow that government advice, and what does it say? It says, the first thing you have to do is book an interview at your job centre. Book an interview at your job centre to happen within the next 10 days. You read that, you think, well, that interview is not going to happen, is it? Because the job centre's closed, and you might have actually signed up because you're self-isolating for 14 days. And then it says the maximum you're going to be able to get is 73 quid. for having lost your job, you might be able to get some extra support in terms of rent and stuff.
If you're under 25, less, no?
Potentially less if you're under. So she gets 73 quid, and it's not going to get paid for 5 weeks.
Yeah.
And the fact that the government is treating people like this, saying there is this terrifying national emergency that's going to kill loads of your family members, and sorry, we don't have any support for you, just some advice. I mean, the thing that I find most disgusting actually about what the government is saying is they're saying self-isolate with your whole family if any of you are sick. And asked about what happens if you've got a vulnerable old person on your household, or someone with diabetes or cancer, they say, oh, well, then you'll have to, play it by ear. And that response is just so fucking outrageous that if you want to be leader of the Labour Party, you have to be able to, after that, go out on TV and say, yes, obviously we want to work with the government. And yes, obviously, say, this is the first time in my life I've wanted the Tory government to be incredibly successful, because this is lives at stake. But it's not good enough to tell people that if you go into work, you're endangering people's lives and your own, and then not give them any capacity to stay at home. And it just seems like such a simple argument. And if you bury that within a 12 tweet thread, or you put it in paragraph 2 of a think piece in either The Guardian or Tribune magazine, no one thinks, oh, thank God there is someone up there representing me. I mean, you have to make yourself heard. It has to sound like it's coming through your voice and your heart, not that your press officer's writing it.
The counter argument is, and I mean, I don't want you to respond to me, so we're going to go to Steve, but the counter argument is, well, the TV isn't giving them the airtime to talk about these things. That's what they might say in response. Steve, do you think that the Labour leadership candidates have been failing on this? They've not made themselves as publicly visible as they could have been?
Well, I was going to make the point that you just made about you need a camera in front of you in order to make the point, and that's difficult at the moment because, as we just had a debate about the news threads and where they are. But it is true to say that you got to get off social media and you got to get yourself in front of ordinary people. Now, if the media are not going to do that, then you need to put yourself out there. You need to get out into communities. You need to get into public areas where you can have a discussion with people, find new ways of talking to people. Now, that's more difficult now, of course, given that it will be negligent to bring large groups of people to have a public meeting or a public gathering. So the use of social media is becoming more and more prevalent during the course of this campaign, not necessarily because the candidates want it to be that way, but because it's becoming increasingly difficult to communicate in any other way if you can't get traction with the national media, the print media, or indeed the visual media through the news broadcasts. Labour's got structural ways in which it can intervene in this debate through select committees and through Prime Minister's question time, direct questions to ministers and the rest of it in the House. But they're going through the appropriate ministers right now. So John McDonnell, for instance, is speaking. He was speaking today on the renter crisis before the announcement this afternoon on private rented accommodation. John's been making the point, and Jeremy's been making the point as the leader of the Labour Party. And Jeremy is still the leader of the Labour Party. That's the reality of this. So at PMQs, he's making the point about the impact on ordinary people of not putting wages in their pockets, not expecting people to take a particular course of action and then not giving them the resources to enable them to do that. That's grossly negligent. And Jeremy made that point at PMQs, and he makes that point consistently. I take the point about what the candidates are doing, and the candidates need to get themselves out there. If you want to be leader of our nation, not just our party, then people need to trust you, they need to have confidence in you, and they need to know that you're on their side. And people right now are very frightened. They are concerned. There's an enormous amount of uncertainty out there about people's futures. They're not confident in what the government are doing. You're absolutely right. And there's a golden opportunity, not to make political points out of this, but to pitch Labour in a way. And in fact, we've got the most Keynesian economic programme that we've ever had. We've got Labour's manifesto, effectively, in a different way, but in a monetary sense, being rolled out. And we should be making hay while the sun shines.
I mean, I feel like I agree with both of you that I look at the three candidates and it almost seems to me none of them even want to be leader of the opposition, let alone Prime Minister. I mean, if you want to be the Prime Minister, you now have to speak. You have to be a counterweight to the government. That doesn't mean you go and lambast them and attack them. It means you articulate the misgivings, the fears, the hopes of tens of millions of people. And I'm not really looking at Keir Starmer or Lisa Nandy or Rebecca Long-Bailey and thinking, yeah, if you're 2 paychecks away from being evicted, or you don't know if you're going to get your university degree this year, or you've got a small business, and millions of people are really shitting it. I don't think they look at those three and go, they're on my side, they're going to help me. That's politics 101. That's not even like an ideological point. That's not even a right-wing Labour leader could do that. I'd rather they didn't. But the point is, how do you articulate yourself as a politician showing leadership in a political crisis? I'm not seeing it, and it shocked me. I thought, for instance, Keir Starmer, who I was never going to vote for him as Labour leader. I always thought he's telegenic, competent. He's had a high-pressure job. He'd be quite good at this. Where is it? I'm not seeing him. And my worry is actually Director of Public Prosecutions has created within him a sense where he just naturally defers to authority, which is what the DPP does often to the government of the day.
Also to her credit, the only person who was on one of the Sunday shows this weekend was Lisa Nandy, and she gave a good performance on Andrew Marr, and she did talk about lots of the inadequacies of the government response. So the idea that either Keir Starmer or Rebecca Long-Bailey could not got on Sophie Ridge's Sunday show on Sky News, I just don't buy it. The idea none of them could have had a phone in on LBC over the last 3 days, I just don't buy it. Like if you're Sir Keir Starmer and you're going to be the next leader of the Labour Party, yes, you're not going to get a fair hearing from all of these various channels. But the idea that you can't find a single camera to put your face in front of over the last 2 weeks, I don't buy it.
We're going to take one more question. One more question.
The last question we're going to take in the studio.
Oh my God.
We don't know how long.
Who knows?
Well, lockdown.
This is from Derby, PA. Can Unite Community, which maybe you can talk a bit about that, Steve.
Yeah.
Can Unite Community organise food and help? I mean, obviously you're quite unique as a major trade union having this wing of what you do. Could Unite sort of Community come into its own in terms of eviction resistance, food, help, etc.?
Absolutely, and in many areas it already is. I'm incredibly proud of our initiative to give a home to people that don't have a collective voice. This is a fantastic initiative that we triggered inside our union to allow those not in paid employment to find a home in our union and to organise on those issues that are really important to them, not through central diktat, but really important to them in their communities. So it was the home of community organising, really. And we've had a whole host of community branches that have already initiated moves in their communities to help those that are self-isolating, to help the elderly, to ensure that people are knocking on doors and seeing whether or not people need assistance. They're campaigning vigorously against the impact of political austerity and have continued to do that, and they'll continue to do that now, and the impact that that's having on social care in our communities at a vital time when we need social care more than we probably needed it before, where local authority cuts. And again, the announcements that have been made by government just this week about business rate exemptions for 12 months for small businesses and now in hospitality, for all businesses now in hospitality. Well, there's been no counter announcements to that to say that the funding lost to local authorities is going to be picked up by central government. And yet local authorities rely on business rates. That's where they get actually a majority of their income to provide not just even essential services in the community, but statutory services in the community. So I think our communities will come together. I'm incredibly confident about that. The goodiness will come out. I think our Unite community branches are bringing that out in communities up and down the countries, from villages to areas in cities. And like I say, I'm incredibly proud of what they're doing, and anything that we can do centrally as a union that I can do. I look after Unite Community inside our union. It's one of my responsibilities. And anything that I can do to promote that, to assist that, to resource that, absolutely I will do. You just get hold of me in the morning on my mobile and I'll do what I can. Derby, PA, no problem. And
if people want to follow you on Twitter, what's your Twitter handle?
I can't remember.
Let me look it up.
Steve T_Unite.
I'll tweet it. Is that it? Steve T
_Unite? _Unite, yeah.
Good. We went.
I never use it. I don't know.
10 minutes over, but I mean, I think it was worth it. It was a great show. It's going to be our last in the studio for quite a while. Steve, you're great.
Thanks.
Hopefully we can get
great show.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Hopefully we can get you in again soon, and hopefully with a bit better news, particularly with regards to your members.
Yeah.
Michael, we were getting some great comments there. One was Michael for PM.
I'm more pissed off than usual.
Well, that's because you didn't have to worry about hosting, so you're kind of off the leash.
Also, I'm just spending most hours of the day thinking, like, what are you waiting for?
Yeah, it's kind of crazy.
Yeah.
We will be back again on Friday. As we've said, we'll be remote working, as hopefully you are too. Of course, not everybody has that luxury. Fortunately, we do. Good night.